Okay. Glynis Sherwood is an individual and couples psychotherapist, coach, author, and educator, known internationally for her video counseling and coaching services, in-depth self-help articles, podcasts, books, and therapist training resources that help people overcome the pain that won't go away. As a pioneering specialist in family scapegoating and relationship trauma, Glynis assists adults and their partners to overcome the hurt of narcissistic family abuse and neglect, low self-worth, chronic grief and anxiety, complex trauma, and relationship challenges. Glynis is based in Halifax, Nova Scotia on the east coast of Canada. She is also the co-author of the book, What Every Target of Workplace Bullying Needs to Know, which is available at overcomebullying.org. Thank you so much, Glynis, for joining me today for this podcast. I'm really, really happy to be talking with you.
Well, thank you so much, Tegan, for inviting me on to speak about these really important topics.
Me too. And I've been looking forward to this so much. And today, Glynis and I are generally going to be talking about the issue of scapegoating, which is Glynis's specialty. And I've just been dying to talk with you about that, Glynis. So a general overview, what exactly is scapegoating, and how does this system take place?
Well, scapegoating is a form of bullying, okay, where an individual is targeted in some kind of system. You know, it's either the family, which is the majority of folks that I work with who are targeted as a problem in the family, usually from childhood, or a workplace where people are bullied, or larger social contexts like we see in cancel culture, like especially in places like social media. It involves targeting somebody as a problem, going after them to basically destroy their character or their reputation, and to have other people join them in basically discrediting that person. So in families, the scapegoat often plays the role of the problem, so that the family doesn't have to actually look at the existing familial difficulties, problems that already exist within the family. This always occurs within the context of a dysfunctional family system, often headed by one or more parents who have a personality disorder, like narcissistic personality disorder. But it can exist also in situations where there might be addiction going on in the family, or other mental health concerns that are being addressed either at all or effectively.
Okay, wonderful. And would that apply? Sorry, go ahead, please.
No, go ahead. Ask me the question.
I was just curious if that would also apply then to other dynamics, say in the workplace. Would there generally be a leader involved in that who has narcissistic personality disorder as well?
I think that's possible, although okay, I think you have to be really careful here, because at least I'm not aware that a lot of studies have been done in this area.
Right.
But in workplaces, you have a certain culture where different values are upheld, whether that's implicit or explicit. Like some workplaces, particularly in the corporate world, really value aggressive people at times because they can get the job done, But then there can also be like a groupthink that's going on, perhaps more in a bureaucracy, where people are ideologically supposed to think along a certain line. And if somebody's an outlier or has a difference of opinion, then they speak up, and there's a disagreement with the overarching dominant culture of the organization, and that can cause conflicts. But there's other reasons that people get singled out to become scapegoated too, which I can talk about if you would like me to.
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. So in workplaces, the people who get scapegoated tend to be the maverick or the rebel.
Okay.
They can also be insecure or troubled people. They can seem vulnerable. Often people who are too kind are vulnerable. They're too nice. The politically naive, people don't understand that you have to kind of play a role and suss out the situation and interact with people strategically. People tend to just say what they think. They tend to be more vulnerable. The person who challenges the status quo. The micromanager victim is a big one. So if you've got a manager who's really preoccupied with not looking like they're slipping up, or they're under sanctions themselves because they're not doing a great job, they're going to lean on the people who are underneath them to perform in ways that will make them feel safer. And this can often take the form of scapegoating. There's the sadist victim, the sadist in the workplace who goes after somebody. There can be folks who have underdeveloped boundaries, often due to family abuse. They can have, for example, inappropriate self-disclosure, and expressing opinions, not being mindful of the political atmosphere that they're working in, where they have to be careful about what they say to people. And so in this respect, there can be some tie-in to people that come from abusive family situations, where they didn't learn healthy or solid boundaries. People who trust others before the trust is earned. They may get in conflict with key players due to, having a solid ethical stance, but one that's not popular. In other words, criticizing the organization, the focus, or the values. So that's what I see in workplace settings. In families, there's a lot of overlap, but often it's the sensitive or vulnerable, honest, or different rebel child that can get into trouble in the family. That kid's usually the truth teller. They may name and stand up for the problem, and then they're punished for having blown the whistle, basically, of what's going on in the family. So they're the person that names the problem. So they break the rules. In our family, we don't talk. There's no problem. We're all great. You're the problem because you're complaining. But almost always there's some kind of child abuse going on, whether it's emotional and or physical.
So
a lot of scapegoats will just take the position that they're unable or unwilling to either be a free therapist to their parent, or a public relations department for the parent as well, which tends to be the main roles that a scapegoat child occupies in a family with a narcissistic parent.
Interesting.
That expectation is there, but then the child pushes back. It's the golden child who steps into the long-term role of fulfilling that for the parent, because that's where the rewards come from. So the scapegoat kid generally doesn't want to do this. In response to that pressure to the parent, the scapegoat kid tends to push back, and then they become ostracized for not wanting to do that, whereas the golden child buys in so that they get some of the benefits of being in the family. And the price that the golden child pays, though, is that the approval is conditional. They're only one slip away from earning parental disapproval. And also, golden children, it's my observation, again, I don't know if a lot of studies have been done here, that the golden child tends to have narcissistic tendencies themselves because they're so deeply indoctrinated into the system in order to be able to survive in there. It's like a psychological hijacking.
Interesting. Okay. Now, does it ever happen? Do you ever see things that are a little outside of the norm, such as perhaps all the children are scapegoats, or both or all children are golden children? Like the mother, the father will live vicariously through their two children who are doctors, like that type of thing. Is that common?
I don't know if it's common, but it certainly happens. I've worked with people who have more than one scapegoat in the family. In some cases, it rotated. Same with golden kids. There's really, although typically what I mean is people who have been singled out individually. Sometimes there are other family members who ended up getting slotted into this role.
I suppose, is it fair to say, especially after if the scapegoat were to leave and entirely sever ties, that they would sort of be forced to move on to a new one? Is that kind of how it works?
Forced to move on to what?
A new scapegoat.
Oh, will the family replace them? I think often, yes, that this is kind of a revolving role because it's about projection. You know, I'm not the problem, you're the problem. So that has to have some place to land. Um, so there can be musical chairs going on with that. But then, of course, you know, kids grow up and move away. But sometimes, you know, the golden child will stay with an older parent over a lifetime. You know, they have a very symbiotic relationship. So occasionally, you know, I'll hear about people who are, you know, 40, 50, 60 years old, still living with a parent as their enabler. You know, it's kind of like a failure to launch situation because there's so much enmeshment going on there. The scapegoated person goes through an incredibly hard time, but I think they have a healthier sense of individuation, you know, which is what feeds their ability to say no. Um, I'll call no on this boundary, but then they're punished and harmed for it, you know, and that causes psychological injury.
Can there be lifelong problems for scapegoats? Like I know this is sort of a big question, Glynis. But if you realize that you're a scapegoat in a situation, is it imperative to get out as soon as possible?
Well, I guess it depends what you mean by get out.
Um, yeah, I think whether it's quit your job, whether it is move away from the family unit and sever ties. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's very subjective, you know,
Right.
and but to answer your earlier question first, you know,
Yeah.
a lot of people that I work with who've been scapegoated have experienced extreme emotional injury to their sense of self-worth and their own personal identity, in addition to PTSD symptoms, which is what we call complex trauma. So a lot of the folks I'm working with are dealing with that. You know, it's kind of like a loss of the self that they're coming into deal with, a loss of self-worth. And this is a byproduct of having been indoctrinated by very punitive parents into believing that they're not a good person. This could get deeply, deeply embedded in people, and it could take years to unravel because it's a lot like Stockholm syndrome, where I actually think people are brainwashed into believing that they're the bad guy, even if it's unconscious. This tends to come out later on in their lives or in the therapy sessions, you know, because if you're hearing that message that you're bad and evil, you know, from early childhood, and we know that that's where kids' identities are formed is by the way their parents treat them, then you can't help but internalize
Right.
at least some of that identity. So that's what I call the internalized scapegoat. I also call it the troll, you know, as an internet troll, you know, like the person who's there to tear you down for no reason, but is pretty successful at it because it tends to be very aggressive. Um, in terms of what people ought to do, you know, do you want me to talk about families first or
Please.
workplaces?
Families would be wonderful, please, Glynis.
Okay, so unfortunately, this abuse, once it gets going, it's like a snowball perpetually going downhill and getting larger because what people are dealing with is a family system where some kind of usually narcissistic abuse has become normative. And the family system is built around normalizing that and protecting it in a way, you know, and the key relationships and wanting to get get favor from the parent is a huge drive for any child.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So this usually will continue not only through childhood but also into adulthood, especially if the scapegoat doesn't comply with the expectations of the abusive family members. You know, that they become subservient or, you know, throw themselves under the bus or allow themselves to continue to be treated as a second-class citizen.
Mm-hmm.
Most people can't tolerate that, and understandably so, you know. So I find that most people will either need to go low contact or no contact with abusive family members, you know, due to these character disordered problems that people aren't willing to acknowledge, you know, or deal with. it's not dealt with constructively. So in order for people to protect their own mental health, then they almost always have to learn how to pull back. Sometimes you pull back and stay back. Other times, people need to adjust to it just by reducing contact, which can work in some situations, and sometimes it's not voluntary. So say for example, somebody is living with an elderly parent as a caregiver, and they don't have any, and the parent is the abuser. They don't have any financial means to get out. Or on a more constructive end of the spectrum is somebody who feels like, even though I have an abusive parent, I feel as an ethical child, I want to be there for my parent in some capacity. So that's more of a reflection of values than being trapped. And then other people, they may not have good relationships with their siblings, because siblings' relationships are usually really harmed in these dynamics, but they want to have contact with their nieces and nephews.
Yeah.
So then they have to continue to navigate the scapegoating waters. But going low contact can be extremely taxing for people to deal with it emotionally. No contact is also a double-edged sword, because although it reduces traumatic injury and allows a person the time to heal their nervous system to the best of their abilities, it leads to a disenfranchised grief. You know what I mean by that term?
No, please explain.
So disenfranchised grief is socially unrecognized grief. So the person who goes no contact with their family generally finds that they get very limited understanding and support from most people.
Oh,
Say unlike a person who's bereaved, where
right.
that's limited in our society to support somebody who's just lost a loved one through death. But there's a stigma around going no contact, especially with parents in our society. Kind of along the lines of, they're the only parents that you have, and you should make the best of it.
Right.
And again, I think it's a lot of misguided people who may not be trying to hurt the person that they're giving that kind of feedback to, are projecting out their own fears and insecurities about their position around a parent, and how threatening that might feel to actually take that route. So I think it just stirs up fear in people that are pushing that agenda on some level, because in their mind, perhaps it's tantamount to social disintegration. If you break contact with an abusive parent, so the abuse doesn't get acknowledged at all in a lot of cases. It's more like it's viewed as a betrayal of the parent. That as a child you have a duty to be with your parent through thick and thin. Whereas a lot of people that I work with, the parents are horrendously abusive, and continue to be into their elderly years. And for that person to continue to be part of that system would be extremely damaging to them.
Right. And then to get this feedback from society, like I've known of people who complete strangers have said to them, "You're a disgusting human being for not being in contact with your family." I mean, just outrageous things. Now, if you don't mind, Glynis, I don't mean to go off on a tangent here, but for those people who have had no choice but to not only go no contact with the personality disordered issue, but person, but say that narcissist has now controlled the entire family. There's a big extended family, and they are controlling every single interaction with the nephews, the nieces, the cousins, grandma, and you have to cut every single one of them off in your life. Do you have any recommendations for people? I mean, I know you don't want to share your business with others, but I've heard of people saying, my family's deceased, or how do you have advice for people in that situation to navigate something like that?
You mean how to respond to others that might be querying them about that?
Yes, or even your own guilt, like I should be a better person. I should be taking this abuse for my extended family, as opposed to just having nothing to do with them whatsoever. Because I know for some people they have to do that, but there's this conflict or this guilt. How do you help those people?
Well, I call that false guilt, and what's even more insidious is how successfully shamed most scapegoats are. And when you think about it, that's what scapegoating is all about. It's a form of vilification or shaming of the individual. So the folks that I work with who are struggling with that, which is often the case, you know, we have to look at that, at the narrative of that, you know, and do a lot of reality testing around that to try to untangle the person from the false shame and guilt. Often there's a wounded child in there that they have to learn how to reparent and reassure. And it's the wounded child that tends to show up when the person becomes very upset and confused about who they are, what their role is in that situation, how good a person they might be. But like any survivor of brainwashing, they have to be deprogrammed in a sense, you know, from these lies, and that can take an extended period of time. In terms of what do you want to say to other people? I mean, it's such an individualistic thing. And, you know, some people say things like, I don't have a lot of contact with my family, and then change the subject, you know, redirect it on, and then ask the person that's asking you a question about themselves.
I like
you know,
that.
People love to talk about themselves.
I like that.
So it's usually pretty easy to redirect, or if you're feeling more confident about who you're talking to, you can always say something like, my family is abusive, and I've decided for my own mental health to not have much contact with them.
Okay, I like that. That's great. That's great.
You know, just kind of treat it in a matter of fact way, and you know, I encourage people to not get into debates. You know, it's kind of like setting a boundary. You know, this is a very painful area for me, and I know you're interested in this, but I just don't feel comfortable going any further. You know, that sort of thing. So there's a number of different approaches.
I like that. I like those.
Okay, so that's families. Do you want me to talk about work a little bit?
Sure. Thank you so much. I would love that.
Okay, so workplace bullying is an area that I used to work more in, but nowadays, the only folks I see are people who have either removed themselves from those situations or are in the rare circumstance where their organization is actually trying to do something constructive about it. And unfortunately, the operative word is rare. Because what I discovered trying to help people that were being targeted at work is that just like a soldier at war, if they come in for PTSD treatment at 7 o'clock at night, you can't patch somebody up to go out into the war arena the next day and expect them to be able to recover, because they're being re-traumatized constantly. In North America, we don't have great track record of protecting bullied people in the workplace. Most organizations do not deal with it constructively or appropriately. And a lot of legislation and even collective agreements and unions, even though they may claim to have a workplace harassment policy, if they exist, they're not enforced, or they're not dealt with in a way that further damages the person who has been scapegoated. And for example, and I'm reading from my notes here because I don't want to miss anything. Please. The problem gets inappropriately framed as interpersonal conflict. Which kind of assumes that there's a level playing field going on here and it's tit for tat. Well, that's not what bullying is. Bullying is aggressive domination attempts by one person over another. Which is done through threats and sometimes through threats, sometimes through intimidation, but just generally creating a psychological atmosphere where the person does not feel safe emotionally. Because of cutting remarks that get made, undermining attempts to interfere with their work, or even outright sabotage to make that person look bad. And the worst one is where people who have been scapegoated get framed up as having a mental illness by their employer.
Oh yes, yes.
So adding insult to injury.
Oh yeah.
So because these organizations, unfortunately, they don't want to admit that there's a systemic nature to the problem. So just like families, you know, when we don't want to admit there's something wrong with the system, that would be really threatening. And we might have to do something from the ground up and look at ourselves, you know, how maybe we might have, if not created this problem, enabled it to continue. And so the scapegoat who goes that route is almost always going to be ostracized in an employment situation. And usually there's either like some sort of toxic work culture, aggression is rewarded, you know, like the aggressive manager who gets things done, right? The people on top of that middle, usually it's a middle manager, but it can't be higher. And actually I've heard of secretaries bullying higher ups. But mostly it's top down. They just see the results that the person gets, you know. So, but generally speaking, there's some sort of competitive hierarchical culture, but also it can happen in workplaces or professions where there's a lot of insecurity going on. You know, like where there's a lot of job loss.
Okay.
Or during the mandates, you know, a lot of healthcare professionals were laid off who didn't get the injections. You know, that creates conditions that are ripe for bullying.
Right.
So there, you know, the scapegoat's usually seen as a threat to the myth of the workplace culture, just like they're seen as a threat to the myth of the family, the good family, right? Well, this person is rocking the boat, you know, so they have to be contained and controlled. So occasionally, I'm hearing more about this, about, you know, workplaces stepping up to the plate to acknowledge the issue and trying to deal with it constructively. But unfortunately, that's still the exception rather than the rule. So often steps are taken to try to isolate the scapegoat, and if they don't comply with the program that comes up, like usually like medical leave is encouraged, you know, which kind of suggests there's something medically wrong with the person, rather than acknowledging that they've been injured. So if you don't admit it's a workplace injury, then that person can end up going down the slippery slope mental health hill, and that's how they get framed by the employer.
Right.
And then if they don't comply with all that, you know, because they're not necessarily viewing it as a mental health problem, they're saying, I'm not mentally ill, I'm being ganged up on. They may be expelled, you know, through a process known as constructive dismissal, which is where the workplace is made so unbearable for the person working there that they have no option but to quit.
Okay. Thank you. I just a couple more points here, Glynis, that I had to ask you about. I hope it's not too complicated, my question, but there's a bit of confusion about the difference between PTSD and complex PTSD. And do these type of situations tend to cause the complex PTSD? And in relation to that, are there therapies that you need to be avoiding, or therapies that are better if you have dealt with something like this, or you're dealing with something like this? Do you have anything to offer in that regard?
Okay, sure. So
thank you.
You want me to start with talking about the difference between complex PTSD and PTSD?
Please.
Okay. So complex PTSD is relationship trauma, and it's developmental relationship trauma, meaning that normally it starts happening in childhood. So the child's sense of self, their self-worth, their identity, their feelings of belonging, their ability to regulate anxiety, all of these things are really compromised, and it occurs over many years in a family home. And with PTSD, what you tend to see is people who've been traumatized, usually by either single or time limited incidents. You know, so they're not things that are going on for like decades at a time. Although in the case of war, you know, or being a refugee, that could be going on for many years. Now, with complex trauma, people may have some or all of the symptoms of PTSD, you know, which includes dissociation, such as flooding or, flooding of feelings or numbing. It's involuntary. They have intrusive thoughts, or memories and feelings, can have nightmares, chronic anxiety, depression, flashbacks, those sorts of things where people feel like they're reliving the traumatic event. So that's kind of like classic PTSD. So people with CPTSD can have all of that, but then they have these injuries to the self on top of that. They feel like they're worthless. They feel shameful. They feel like they're bad. They feel responsible for creating the problems in the family. They have a very harsh inner critic usually, who gives them a really hard time, which is the internalized voice often of the critical parent, and that can be unconscious or conscious. If it's unconscious, it's particularly hard to deal with, because the person's not aware that this narrative is abusing them, and it's not a fact. It's just a narrative. They can have difficulty protecting themselves, like during childhood and later on in life, because they don't have a healthy sense of appropriate boundaries. They may not achieve their potential, or they may not protect their boundaries because they feel like they don't deserve to have their boundaries protected. They can get into what Freud called repetition compulsion. And so an example of that is trauma bonding, where they gravitate towards people who abuse them, because in abusive family dynamics, love and abuse are intertwined. So that can become somebody's love map. They're really only drawn to people who make them feel excited, but also fearful. And what's really going on there is that they feel anxious and fearful, but they mix up excitement with anxiety. So it's like how to unpair from that and learn to be drawn to people who have more of a healthy attachment adaptation, so that they won't be repeating the same injuries that they sustained at the hands of their family with either friends or a loved one. And it can't happen with friends. I've seen people get into trauma bonded situations with friends as well as an intimate partner. With CPTSD, what we're looking at here is called capture bonding. And what that means is just like a kidnapping victim, you can't get away.
Okay. And
so,
that would,
say somebody may be a victim of a home invasion, but after the home invasion's over, they may have some PTSD, but they can get away. The child can't get away, so they have to rely on a parent they can't depend on, who's actually frightening, makes them feel frightened and insecure. And then they deal with it by believing that they're the bad child, and then if they can fix themselves, they'll earn the love of the parent who rejects them. That's often the core psychological difficulty that people coming into therapy have, who have been through these kinds of family situations.
Okay. This just popped into my head. It wasn't in my notes, but I feel like you're the perfect person to ask this, because I've heard this come up on a number of occasions. Is complex PTSD ever misdiagnosed as borderline personality disorder? Because I think there's some similarities on the surface, maybe. I'm not sure. Please, if you could explain that a bit.
Yeah. Well, I think there's some theoretical debate around, is complex trauma BPD, borderline personality disorder, and vice versa.
Right.
With the people that I work with, I don't necessarily see a lot of splitting or emotional lability like you might with somebody with classic BPD. So I think that there are likely some distinctions, but for me, it's kind of like splitting hairs.
Okay.
The main thing is, how do you help somebody who's in that position?
Okay.
Do you know what I mean by splitting?
I do. I appreciate you making that distinction. I know others make a very clear, they seem to believe that BPD is more of a female antisocial personality disorder. So they make a huge distinction. Others do not do that. So I appreciate your stance on that, because it has caused me some confusion as well.
Yeah, I certainly don't think of borderline as antisocial. although the person can engage perhaps in antisocial behavior when they're distressed.
Okay.
Most borderline people, I think, are quite vulnerable emotionally, but also they're capable of empathy. And anybody who's antisocial usually is drawn on a real deficit, um, when that's what their psychological presentation is. Because
Okay.
antisocial personality disorder or personality is basically conflated with sociopathy or
Yes.
psychopathy, and that's certainly not the borderline person's problem. You know, their problem is with
Okay.
emotional dysregulation,
Okay.
especially when it comes to relationships. You know, and they can be extremely vulnerable to the point of being very self-destructive. You know, the
Yes.
harms tend to be directed more towards themselves, and um, although they can rage at people inappropriately when triggered, they're
Yes.
not out to get people like antisocial
Yes.
personalities are.
This is what I thought. This was my confusion, because when I thought of borderline personality disorder, I think of a woman with either very serious narcissistic personality disorder or antisocial, and that is kind of what has been in my mind. But then I've also heard complex PTSD being conflated with it, and I'm like, well, that's not that. These are people who are suffering and have interpersonal issues, so that does not sound like a psychopath. So I really appreciate you speaking about that, because there definitely seems to be some debate, confusion, difference of opinion in that area.
Yeah, they're not necessarily the same thing. I don't think, but usually often the
Okay.
source is similar. You know, which is childhood trauma,
Okay.
lack of appropriate parenting, and almost always some form of abuse. You know, is what I've come to understand.
Okay. Thank you. That really makes sense. And is there anything, I know we're kind of tying off here, Glynis, is there anything that I missed that we should touch on a little bit?
Well, I don't think I answered your question yet about therapy,
Yes.
and
Oh, yes, please, please. Yes. Proper
so
therapies.
I don't know that there are any particular therapies that I would go out of my way to avoid, although you might not want to do Freudian therapy, but then again, you know, Freudian therapy has really fallen out of popularity over the last several decades, you know, um, because it's really more concerned with free association and tapping into the unconscious than, you know, dealing with some of these problems more directly in a problem solving kind of way, which I think is important for people who have this kind of trauma. But generally, I'd say just avoid therapists who just dismiss family scapegoating, abuse, or workplace bullying as mental health problems, or blame the target. And also therapists who push a family reunification agenda, you know, when it's not appropriate. You know, I think, you know, the analogy I give is, you know, would you encourage somebody whose partner beats them up regularly to go back to them? You know,
Right.
well then
Right.
no. Well then you shouldn't be encouraging a family member to go back and get beaten up again by their family. And when
Yeah.
people don't understand like this, especially if it's a professional they're going for help to, this causes a phenomena called secondary wounding. So with secondary wounding, the person is re-injured by the people that they go to help for, which can
Right.
compound the traumatic injury, which can compound the complex trauma, you know, and people can end up feeling very helpless and depressed, you know, as a result of having been treated like that, because that's the way they were treated in their family or in their workplace. Um, so I think the main things are, you know, therapy or coaching should be coming at this like on the premise that the scapegoat is an abuse survivor who needs
Mhm.
validation and support.
Mhm.
Most of the people that I see, it's not an issue of whether this happened to them or not. I work with people who have a hard time accepting that this happened to them. You know, so that's what we're focusing on. You know, yeah, it did happen to you. Um, so I can talk about briefly about what therapy or coaches should do, and I think they need to help people survive, manage, and overcome any existing trauma symptoms.
Sure.
You know, if If the trauma symptoms are severe, then you should probably be working with a therapist rather than a coach. You're going to be targeting false negative beliefs and family programming. So the therapist needs to be versed in this. And I don't think a lot of people are, and this is not really a critique of therapists, but I don't think there's a lot of training out there yet about how, the different elements that need to go into doing this kind of work. And it's taken me many, many years to try to figure out, what are the essentials in this therapeutic approach. And I don't know that I have it totally figured out yet, but there's a few key features. And anybody who has a systems orientation, I think it's probably wise to select somebody who has some kind of systemic understanding of what's happening. Otherwise, you're going to completely miss the big picture of what's going on. This is very important in our society that tends to atomize people and focus on the individual, kind of in a vacuum, So I think having a systemic approach is essential.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Glynis, are you still, just to finish off here, are you still working in this field? Are you still taking clients? How can people find you and the work that you're doing?
I have an active therapy and coaching practice. I work with people all around the world.
Wonderful.
Right now I have a very long wait list. I have a long wait list. It usually takes about 3 to 4 months to get in to see me, but if people can go on my site and fill out my appointment request form, and I'll get back to them within a couple of days. But I just wanted to let people know that there is a bit of a wait, because I'm only one person, and I'm doing this with folks in different locations. This is my life's work, and I'm probably going to be doing this until I can't. And if people don't have the money or the resources for therapy, they can certainly sign up for my free ebook. And I send my articles and podcasts out when I produce. So I've got over 100 articles on my site just on these topics that we've been discussing here alone. I tend to write feature articles, so they're not fluff pieces. I go into quite a bit of depth about how to handle certain situations, like if you choose to go no contact, for example, how to develop healthy relationships in recovery, that kind of thing. So those things are available. There's an organization that I recommend to people. This is focused on people who are dealing with family abuse, and that's the Adult Survivors of Childhood Abuse. That's an online support program that exists in a lot of places. It's a really high quality program, and they have trained facilitators. It's free, and I have several clients who participate in this community and only have good things to say about it. Therapy or coaching can be great, but you have to have a disposable income in order to be able to do that. So this is just another resource where people can go on there and get some support, get support between sessions, because as we're talking about here, this is a very isolating experience.
Yes.
It hasn't been normalized, where people can kind of come out as a group collectively and say, hey, hello, we're here, we need your support, we need this to stop. There's still a lot of shame and stigma attached to having been abused by family.
Right.
That gets slathered onto the victim, which is highly problematic. Now, in terms of workplace bullying, I think that if you're working with an employer who either rewards, ignores, minimizes, or dismisses or incorrectly frames workplace bullying as a personality conflict, then I think most of the time you need to leave before your mental health becomes compromised. No job is worth destroying your mental health. And people might be sitting there saying, well, it's easy for you to say in this economy, but I really believe that. But the important thing to do there is to get references in writing, because nobody's going to backpedal and lie about you if you've got a written reference saying you were fine.
Okay.
At least it's harder to, without making that person look like a fool or a liar.
Right. Very good advice, Glynis. And I am just so grateful to you for taking the time to do this with me today. I know you mentioned this is something that is a little out of here. Is not something you do a lot of, the video chats with people like myself, and you're fantastic at what you do, and I am very, very grateful that you're out there. And I had the privilege, I can't remember how I came across you. It was some research I was doing on workplace bullying, and I came across your website, and I was like, I have to talk to this lady. I mean, that this type of help, it seems to be hard to come by, and I just want to thank you so much for everything that you do.
You're welcome. Well, I mean, you're right. It's an emerging field, and I think that we've got a long way to go. And also, we're at a point in history that unfortunately there's like a head-on collision into the reality of cancel culture, which tends to operate like bullies and scapegoats, people who aren't in alignment with the with the doctrine that they're subscribing to, and treating people in a similarly abusive fashion, based on emotional reasoning and lack of any kind of objective truth. So it's a difficult time for people to be trying to face this head on when we've got this social force that has been moving in this direction of attacking people in these kinds of abusive ways, becoming normative. So I think it's highly problematic, because I think that the tables are starting to turn, but the public vilification of people just for having differences of opinion is deeply problematic, and can certainly be rewounding for individuals who experience this kind of trauma. You asked about, do family scapegoats tend to be more inclined to be victimized in workplace? I think that they can be, because of some of their vulnerabilities. Sometimes they're just different too, or they're a bit of a maverick or a rebel, and sometimes they do say things where they're putting their foot in their mouth, but that doesn't justify abusing and discarding people like this, to the point where I think the objective with a lot of cancel culture is to destroy people.
Absolutely.
This is antisocial behavior, which has no place in a civil society. And these are the kinds of debates that we need to be having, which we're not having enough of, I think, because people are so concerned about being, either bullied by people who perpetuate this kind of behavior, who hide out behind anonymous handles in a lot of cases online,
right?
Which I think should be. I agree with Jordan Peterson that opportunity should be removed, and people should have to name who they are unless they're in a vulnerable position.
Yeah.
Genuinely, we need to take the bullying, the normativeness of bullying out of society, or at least what's the opposite of rewarding? What's the word I'm looking for?
You punish, I suppose you could say,
or not punish necessarily, but just disincentivize doing this.
Yeah, this discouraging, or yeah, discouraging maybe.
Yeah, just discouraging it. It should be viewed as inappropriate social behavior.
Absolutely.
If we're going to have any hope as a human race, I think we need to focus on similarities, and not emotional reasoning that can just lead to the immoral fanaticism, that where people are being intolerant, policing and punishing and denouncing innocent people just for having a difference of opinion. I mean, this is the foundation of scientific debate, and also this is the way that universities traditionally used to be run too, but less so nowadays. This kind of mindset has crept into post-secondary institutions as well, and we see a lot of people just want to engage in the thinking process, and learn and developing critical thinking skills, being shut down or shut out unfairly.
Right. And I guess it's fair to say as well that with the social media aspect, it can make it just heightens it. It kind of blows it up. And then the anonymity piece, as you were saying.
Yeah, I think we need to focus on character and encouraging people to operate from principles, which I think are kind of viewed as old-fashioned values nowadays. But if we ever want to stem the tide of narcissism, whether it's in the family system, the workplace, or in social media, this is where the emphasis needs to be redirected back towards, what are the core features of good character? How can we promote that development in others, of kindness, of civility, of curiosity, so that we can treat each other the way that we want to be treated, and get exposed to the diversity that our species is all about.
Yeah, the things that make life the richest and most worthwhile, in my opinion.
Otherwise, we're living in a climate that's more about tyranny and censorship and adherence to a very narrow ideology, where critical thinking and the sharing of these good qualities is really de-emphasized, and in some cases devalued, which creates a lot of aggression, and I think caters to baser qualities in human beings, like mobbing, ganging up on people. Humans have a capacity to do this, and I think it needs to be discouraged. And actually, I guess just to close, I wanted to close with a quote by Tennessee Williams. Do you know who he is?
I do. Please, I would love that. Thank you.
Okay, so very, very famous playwright and author. He said, "Cruelty is a drug, and it's all around us. Don't imbibe."
Short and sweet. I like that. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining me today, Glynis. It was an absolute pleasure to speak with you. I had a great time. Thank you so much. And maybe we'll do it again one day. That'd be great. Thanks. Have a great day, and we'll talk in just a moment here.